Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to Monday, welcome to week 9. Welcome to I don't know, can I say spring in Vancouver? Does it feel springy yet? No? It will. We're close. Trees and bushes are going to be budding right away. Flowers will pop up. It'll be beautiful. Let's see. So only a few people here so far. So Hadil is here. Good morning, Hadil. Irene is here. Good morning, Irene. And Michelle is here. Good morning, Michelle. So just to jump in where we were yesterday, or Friday, I should say, we were talking a little bit about ancient Greece, and we had kind of very quickly skipped our way through some early Bronze Age civilizations in Greece, right? So we had the Minoans living on the island of Crete. That's that green island that you see on the slide. There was the Mycenaeans that were living on the mainland. Both of them seem to have exerted sort of economic and political power over the areas around them. It seems that at one point the Mycenaeans may have conquered the Minoans, because we see the Mycenaean writings showing up in the palace records of the Minoans, but we're not entirely sure. And as we mentioned, we can't really read much of what's going on, right? We don't know how to read the Minoan written language. The Mycenaean language we have some clarity on, but for the most part we can't read it. And so we're not really sure what's going on. But we do know that, again, that sort of centralization collapses around 1100 BCE, so around 3,000 years ago. So people kind of abandon the cities, abandon the palaces. They go off into the hills and just kind of, live in a very in a very sort of decentralized way. Nobody's really writing anything down in this period of Greek history, at least not in Greece. So we don't really know what is happening. But it seems that after a few hundred years, by about 800 BCE, Greek culture is sort of starting to coalesce or form again. And so we see people starting to write things down, but in a new written language, in ancient Greek this time. We see the first Olympic Games being held. We hear these stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey, both of these epic Greek stories that finally get written down in the Archaic period. Again, we don't really know how old the stories are. The stories could be centuries old before that even, but they finally get written down in the Archaic period. And the Archaic period is also, I believe, going to be home to kind of the beginnings of kind of ancient Greek history. And if you look, ancient Greek history really isn't that long a period. And again, it's interesting that Greece has had such a significant impact on the Western world, because really it's, you're looking at maybe a couple of hundred years tops in terms of classical Greek civilization, right? Like things kind of get going, around 600 or 700 BCE, but by 300 BCE, Greece has been conquered by Philip of Macedon, and they're no longer an independent culture. And again, the Romans will conquer them after that, and they'll remain part of that empire under the Byzantines. And then, so really the ancient Greece that everyone thinks about is really just a couple hundred years of history. It's very, very short. But that's kind of what we'll transition into today. We watched a short little video on Friday talking a little bit about the Greek gods, and we learned that people kind of worshipped these gods maybe at different times depending on what they needed or what they wanted, but also certain city-states, certain polis had certain patron gods as well, right? And again, Athens is Athena. The city-state is actually named after her, so it's the easy example. Although I think we heard conflicting messages on the patron god of Sparta, right? I think the textbook said it was Artemis, and the video said it was Ares, or the other way around, right? So maybe it's both, or maybe somebody's mistaken. But either way, the gods were kind of worshipped depending on who was your favorite and depending on what you needed. Again, we're kind of introducing these two city-states, Athens and Sparta. Both of them will become important in the history of ancient Greece. They'll become important kind of players. They're both kind of legendary in their own way. Athens has kind of a reputation as, the birthplace of democracy, the birthplace of philosophy and science and academics, and whether or not that's true or not, that's the reputation it has. And Sparta has a kind of a legendary status, as well as kind of the best warriors of the ancient world, right? And so they're immortalized in that movie 300. Has anyone seen 300? Highly unrealistic, very stylized, but the story seems to be true in that what's that? Yeah. So, but the way they portrayed it is not. But yeah, so they, a small force of 300 Spartans defend against the entire Persian army and hold them off.
No, they didn't.
Well,
but they got betrayed. That's why.
Yeah, until they get betrayed. But until that, they were, yeah. So they have kind of mythical, legendary status, I guess the Spartans do. And so here you can see, if we zoom in a little bit, there's Athens. There's Athens kind of toward the tip of, I guess, mainland Greece. And then there's this Peloponnese area, which is that island that's just connected by that little spit of land. And so Sparta kind of has control. At their height, Sparta has control of most of the Peloponnese area, and Athens, at their height, has control of most of the sort of mainland area. But you can see how many other little Greek polis or polises there are, right? So there's a bunch of them scattered throughout Greece. Did I ask you to read this on Friday, or did I say, we don't have enough time? What's that? We did not? Okay. I'm going to give you some time to read it now. Irene says, so Xerxes wasn't actually a superhuman. I'm sure that's a little sarcastic. No, he wasn't. He was simply a Persian king who decided he wanted to take over Greece. It's actually kind of a funny story, but maybe we'll hear about it in the video, and if we don't, I'll explain to you where the conflict between the Greeks and the Persians actually comes from. But we'll see if the video tells the story, and if it doesn't, I'll fill you in on that. So, all right, I'm going to give you just a little bit of time to read this. It's only a few pages, so I'll just put some time on the clock here, and then we'll talk about a few questions, and that will set us up for the video, I think. Okay, ready, Shreddies? Yes, no, maybe so. Anybody out there? Hello? So these questions are, I'm going to give you a little more information because I kept them from a time in this class when we used an entirely different textbook. And so the textbook talked about some of these things in a little more detail, but I'll add some things in. But let's start out with number one. What's a tyrant? A ruler? An unjust ruler? Sure. What else can we add to that? You're not wrong, but let's flesh that out a little bit. How do you mean unjust? Yeah, in some ways they kind of have sole power, so they are able to do whatever they want. What else is important about them? Often that is the case, right? And how did they come to power in the first place? Yeah, sometimes they take advantage of chaos. They come to power in an illegitimate way, or at least illegitimate according to the constitution of the city-state. And they often come to power kind of. They're empowered by the people themselves, and so in a way you can kind of think of them. Maybe the more modern terms we use for tyrants are kind of populists or dictators. That's kind of what a tyrant is. I think initially, now we kind of have a negative connotation of that word, right? If someone's a tyrant, that's a bad thing, right? I think at the time in ancient Greece, it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It was just a label, but I think it became a bad thing for them later on. We'll get to a tyrant here, but first of all, let's talk about Solon. And so Solon was an Athenian. He's appointed as maker of laws, I think was his title. And he was asked to do, what was he asked to fix? Like, what was the problem? What were his reforms, or what was he trying to fix? Yeah, he was trying to fix the constitution of Athens, because what was occurring? Yeah, so lots of people had been sold into debt slavery, right? So again, nowadays, if you can't pay your bills, often you'll go into debt, right? And you'll have to pay off your credit card bills. Sometimes creditors will start calling you and attacking you, and that's not very fun either. Eventually, you'll have to declare bankruptcy in court, and then nobody will give you any credit anymore. But there's kind of mechanisms in modern society to deal with people who can't pay their bills. But in the past, none of that exists, right? There's no such thing as declaring bankruptcy or going to bankruptcy court or being protected from your creditors. There's no such thing. right? And so people who can't pay their bills in the ancient world wind up enslaved, right? And so if Nicholas can't pay his bills to me, then he's going to work for me for a set period until he works off his debt, right? And so lots of people in ancient Athens wind up in that situation. But again, you can't really run an economy when everyone is enslaved to other people, right? It doesn't work. And so Solon is asked to reform the constitution, and so he makes I think there's probably three major changes that we should pay attention to. And what's one of them? Yeah, so debt forgiveness, right? He forgave everyone's debt. Nobody's a debt slave anymore. All of that is done. Everyone is free, right? Step one. Step two, what's he do? Yeah, he divided people into 5 classes. What are those classes based on? Yeah, income and status, right? So he divides society up into people who have money and power and people who have less money and less power. And what's kind of the third thing he does? It's connected to that second thing. What's that? Maybe. I was thinking, what did he do with those classes after he created them? Say that one more time. Oh no, that comes later. The tyrant comes later. Oh. Right. So these 5 economic and power classes that are created in Athenian society, they all have a different ability to participate in the political system, right? So people have been given some political power in Athens depending on your economics and your sort of societal status, but still not a democracy, right? Then we have the tyrant. What's his name? Yes, good for you for trying to pronounce it. Pysistridus. So very close. Pysistridus is a tyrant. They don't tell the story in the textbook, but apparently what he did was he rode into town one day in a wagon or in a chariot or some such thing with this beautiful young woman beside him. And the beautiful young woman claimed that she was Athena. She was the goddess of wisdom and war. And so she came riding in. She said, "I am Athena, and I support Pysistridus as your leader." And the people seem to have gone along with that. It's not clear whether they actually believed that this girl was Athena. She was not. She was just a farm girl he had picked up further up the road. She was not Athena, but it's not clear whether the people believed that she was, or if they simply just liked the kind of things that Pysistridus was saying. And again, populists are like this, right? Populists gain power by basically telling the people what they want to hear, whether it's right or wrong or good or bad. And so Pysistridus kind of gains power because the people like the kind of things that he's saying, and so they start listening to him. They start going along with the things that he decrees, and so he kind of seizes power that way. By all accounts, people seem to like Pysistridus as a tyrant. He makes lots of good economic reforms. In this period under Pysistridus, the Athenians start trading more with the Mediterranean. They start to make money, which people really like. People like political leaders who make them money, and Pysistridus is one of those. And so people are actually pretty happy with Pysistridus as a leader. but he's not a legitimate leader, right? He's illegitimate. He's a tyrant, but again, he does pretty well for Athens, and Athens pretty much likes him. But then what happens? Then what happens? We've got Pysistridus, but then he I don't think his son gets killed, but he himself dies. So Pysistridus himself dies, and he is succeeded by his two sons, first Hippias and then Hipparchus, I believe. Hippias turns out to not be as good of a tyrant as his father. He starts out okay, but then his brother is killed, I think, if I remember the story. And after that, Hippias is distraught and paranoid, and he starts rounding up people and executing them, trying to find the murderer of his brother or his friend, I forget. And he basically turns into a really problematic tyrant. And so the Athenians have to overthrow him. They have to kick him out. And I think they do so with the help of the Spartans. Or maybe that's Hipparchus who comes later. Either way, the Athenians throw out this bad tyrant after they had a good tyrant. And then there's a question, right? There's a question of now what do we do now that we've thrown out the tyrant? And that's where our friend Cleisthenes enters the picture. What does Cleisthenes do? What's Cleisthenes do? Yeah, and maybe less specifically, he basically creates democracy in Athens. And so he works with, the basic classifications that Solon started with, right? Because Athenians were already participating in the political arena. But here he basically gives all the power to the people, which in the ancient world is revolutionary, right? Because the ancient world is ruled by kings, and those kings have armies behind them. And they're in power because the army says so, right? Except maybe in ancient Egypt where, you're seen as a god because you come from a certain family. But for the most part, the ancient world, power is centered in one person, right? Someone who has conquered through military might, or someone who is a religious figure of some sort. But here, Cleisthenes does something totally bizarre and unprecedented in the civilizations of the ancient world. And he does so for a couple of reasons, okay? We talked about this. I'm just going to jump ahead here. Yeah, so Cleisthenes has a bit of a problem because after the tyrant is out, after they kick out the tyrant, he's not really sure what to do, right? And so, again, he doesn't want to create an oligarchy, right? Because if he creates some sort of council of aristocrats, the aristocrats will continue to fight amongst themselves, as they have been. So the noble families will try to gain power and influence. There'll be fighting and poisonings and all kinds of, chaos behind the scenes. People will fight for power. If he tries to create a monarchy, well, monarchies are great if you have a Pysistridus, right? If you have a good leader, things are great. If you have a Hippias, if you have a bad leader, things are miserable, right? And so neither of these are really options, at least for Cleisthenes. There's a couple other things that are happening in the background too in Athens. One of them is that the common people have been empowered, okay? And so, there's a feeling often in the ancient world that the nobles are so much better than the regular people, right? There's a big difference in terms of power and status. But for the Greeks, they've kind of had a democratizing idea happening in their society already, right? The Olympic Games, to compete in the Olympic Games, you have to be the best. And it doesn't matter what you are, right? It doesn't matter if you're a fisherman or a shoemaker or a noble or a king or the son of a king, or doesn't matter who you are, right? It's all about skill. It's all about your ability to athletically perform, right? So you can go into the wrestling ring at the Olympic Games as a fisherman. You can wrestle a king and beat him, and you will be congratulated for it, right? Because the winner is the winner, right? So that's kind of those ideas are kind of like breaking down. The status still exists, but common people are empowered by that idea, right? The idea that you could defeat a king, right? You could be the best at the Olympic Games. And so some of those ideas are wrapped up in the Homeric poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? In the Iliad and the Odyssey, the glory is reserved for the heroes, right? For Achilles and for Hector and for Odysseus. But over time in this period, the Greeks come to see that anyone could be a hero. You don't have to be a noble person, right? Anyone can be heroic. And again, look at the Olympic Games. Anyone can be the victor. Doesn't matter what your status in life is. We also see this in Athens, this idea that the people have been empowered, right? First by Solon. Solon gave them the ability to participate in the politics of the city-state. But then Pysistridus showed the people that they had power too, because they'd put him in power. The regular people had put Pysistridus in power. And so that empowered them as well, right? That helped the regular people feel that they too could have a say in their city-state, right? The other thing I mentioned is that under Pysistridus, Athens became quite wealthy, right? There was lots of trade going through Athens. They were able to charge lots of sales taxes and tariffs. They sold lots of olive oil and exported it all throughout the Mediterranean. They were actually becoming very wealthy. And often when people have economic wealth and economic power, they want political power too. They want a say in how the state runs. And so that happens in Athens. And again, Cleisthenes looks and says, we can have a monarchy or an oligarchy, but neither of those really work, right? Oligarchies just lead to infighting, and monarchies, you're a hostage to how good your leader is. And if it's a horrible leader like Hippias, you're stuck with misery, right? What to do? And so he creates democracy, right? He basically, there's a very complicated diagram, which actually I would like to study a little bit later on today. But there's a very complicated diagram of how Athenian democracy works. But in effect, there's a citizens' assembly and there's law courts, right? And everything gets decided by Athenian citizens who own property and who are male. So it's not quite everybody. And they vote on everything. Okay? They vote on every proposition that comes before the assembly, the Athenians vote on. And the same thing with the law courts. At a law court, the Athenians will judge you, right? If you commit a crime, your people will either convict you or acquit you, right? And it's a very, in principle, it's a very simple thing, although if you look at the diagram, you'll see that it's not quite as simple as you might think. But in principle, it's a very simple idea, but it's one that really no one else in the ancient world hits upon. The idea to give the power to the people, unheard of, right? Nobody does that, right? Everyone has usually some form of monarchy. Kings, pharaohs, emperors, whatever. And, maybe that makes sense though, because as we mentioned last week, Greece is kind of an odd place for a civilization, right? It's not a river civilization like we see before. There's not people, practicing intensive agriculture next to the river and it doesn't really, Greece doesn't really fit that profile, and it doesn't really evolve in quite the same way as some of those other civilizations do. So maybe it makes sense that they would come up with a very novel solution to how to run a city-state. But here you'll see that they do, right? You'll also see that in the diagram below it that Sparta runs quite a bit differently than does Athens, right? And so again, I mentioned that to live in Athens is a different experience than living in Sparta, right? And we can talk a little bit more about those two city-states as we go on, because again, they're both Greeks, and they saw each other as Greeks, or Hellenes, I guess is the correct term. But they also knew that they were quite a bit different in terms of how they organized their lives. Yeah. Okay. Any questions at the moment? Mm-mm. Okay. Let's take a quick break. We'll come back and we will talk about. We'll explore the beginnings of this democracy, because it's worth looking at. Okay, and we're back. So, again, we're going to look at this process of kind of early democracy because, again, I think it's an important part of the Greek world. It's certainly an important part of the story of Athens, and I think it's an important aspect of world history. Right? We have multiple powerful countries that are run by democracies, and not both, but many of those democracies look back to the Greek world, or they look back to the Roman world that was looking back to the Greek world. And so, there's a lot of influence that this short little period of ancient history has had on the world. And so I think it makes sense to pay a little more attention to exactly what was going on in ancient Athens. So, to that end, I have a little video for us to watch, and we'll watch about 29 minutes of it today. And I've got a bunch of questions here about the superpower at the time of classical Athens. What is the agora? What were Athenians trading during this period? You might have a clue to some of these answers already, but that's okay. How did democracy come to Athens? What were some of the structures built and tools invented to facilitate democracy in Athens? Oh, that's pretty cool. Yeah. Democracy requires technology. How did people become members of the Council of 500, or become a magistrate, or become a juror? Who could and could not vote in Athens? What do we learn about women in Athens? What do orators do, or orators? I don't know how to pronounce that. What did the Athenians do with money from the discovery of silver? Spoiler alert, they're going to discover some silver. What is a trireme? And what do the Athenians contact the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, or why do they contact the oracle? I'm going to start again. Why do the Athenians contact the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, and what answer do they receive? Okay.
You're going to answer all of them in 3 minutes?
Maybe. We'll see how it goes.
Good luck.
Good luck. I have faith in you. I have faith in you. So online people, you'll see that the questions and the link are in Microsoft Teams, kind of in the main channel. You'll see a little post there. So what we'll do is online people will set you free to watch about the first 29 minutes or so, and then we'll come back here and discuss what we've seen, okay? So Microsoft Teams has the link in the questions. Go and watch the first 29 minutes, then come back here and we'll talk, okay? So we'll see you in a little bit. All right, so very interesting so far, I would say. Very quickly, who's the superpower in the time of classical Athens? Persia, yeah. So Persia has amassed a giant empire in Central Asia, right? And they're going to get into a conflict with the Greeks, which probably isn't a good idea for the Greeks because, again, the Greeks are kind of nobody, right? They're a bunch of little city-states. They're not unified. And here they're facing this massive empire. The battle they talked about at Marathon, the first time the Persians invade, it's a bit of a miscommunication they have, because the Greeks go to the court of, I think it's of Cyrus at the time. Cyrus is Xerxes' father. I think they go to the court of Cyrus and they talk to him, and I think that the result of that meeting, Cyrus thinks that the Athenians have kind of pledged loyalty to Cyrus, but that's not what they did. They just went to sort of talk with him. But Cyrus thinks that the Athenians have pledged loyalty. And then a little bit later, several years later, a Greek city-state that's in what's in modern Turkey now, that city-state has a ruler that Cyrus has installed. Okay, so he's appointed a ruler of this city-state. And then the Greek citizens revolt and try to overthrow Cyrus's ruler. And the Athenians go to help this Greek city-state. And so Cyrus is like, what's with this? I thought the Athenians just pledged loyalty to me. Now they're helping their fellow Greeks overthrow my ruler. So Cyrus, that kind of gets up Cyrus's nose, and he decides to go and teach the Athenians a lesson. And so he marches his army down. He doesn't march, he actually sails down. They come ashore at Marathon, where the Athenians are there to greet them. And kind of almost accidentally, the Athenians win. And so the Persians come ashore at a bad place. It's really like soft and marshy. And what the Persians think, they're going to bring their ships up and start shooting arrows at the Greeks from the shore. But actually what happens is that the Athenians rush the Persian ships. So the Persian ships are trying to land. The archers aren't really ready and can't kind of get a good shot at the Athenians. And the Athenians kind of are on top of the Persians before the Persians are even ready to do anything. And so the Athenians basically cut them to bits and send them home with their tail between their legs. And so it's kind of an accidental victory. It's not a victory they should have won, but they miraculously do. And so the result of that, of course, is that the Persians have a little bit of a grudge against the Athenians, and so Xerxes, of course, is coming back to avenge his father's defeat and to avenge the defeat at Marathon. And Themistocles knows this, and that's where the Themistocles things comes in, but we'll come back to that. What's the agora? What was the agora? Yes. It's not present. Why do you find her accent a little tricky?
Yeah, it's hard to follow up.
Okay. I don't happen to have one in the back of my pocket, but that's part of the reason why we're talking now, is so that we can get a better understanding of what's supposed to happen here, or not what's supposed to happen, but what was happening in the documentary. Say that again? Well, it's definitely the place people meet together, right? So it's the center of the city. That's where the markets are. That's where people come to hang out. It's kind of it's the town square, right? It's the place where everyone goes to hang out. It's kind of, it's the shopping mall and the park all combined into one, right? That's where people go to walk around, to be seen, to go shopping, to meet friends. All of these things happen in the agora, right? In the center of town. Did it mention this one in the documentary? Who they were trading with? Africa and what? Oh, right, okay. Yeah, Africa, Northern Africa, Italy, the Black Sea, what was called Asia Minor that we would now call Turkey. With Italy, they had colonies in Italy. So the Greeks are trading all throughout that sort of Mediterranean world. They've got, wherever you are, they've got people on the ground trading things, right? Lots of olive oil, but other things as well. Yeah, I guess the story of how democracy came to Athens, we've kind of heard that story already, right? The idea that they had a good tyrant and then a bad tyrant. The tyrants are overthrown, and then there's the question of what to do, right? What to put into place, and it's a noble person. It's a guy named Cleisthenes who decides the constitution we'll have is we'll give power to the people. This is the only way. It's the only way that Athens can have some form of stability, right? And again, it's a revolutionary idea. In some ways, it shouldn't work, but it does. And part of the way that they get this to work is through technology. So, what kind of technology are the Greeks using to or the Athenians using to do their democracy? But okay, so not a technology, but yeah, they the host made a big deal about the fact that elections happened, right? So people were elected, but people were also drawn randomly, right? So she says, yeah, like that's like a new prime minister every month, and it could be you or me or any of us, right? Which again seems bizarre. I don't know if I would want our prime minister chosen by random name out of a hat, but I don't know, how bad could it be? Anyway, that's the way the Athenians did it, right? There were elections, but there were also random selection, right? And in terms of juries, how were they randomly selecting juries? They what? Well, yeah, they voted with those little metal discs, right? Those little bronze discs. And so the little bronze disc had a little indentation on one or another, right? So you could go up and you could toss in your ballot and nobody would know what you voted until they counted them, right? So if you were going to convict someone, say somebody was charged with murder and you were going to convict them, you could vote and toss your ballot in there and nobody would know what you voted until they count them all out, right? What else did they use? Yeah, brilliant, hey? So you go in on that day, you've got a little metal name tag, you stick your name tag in the slot, and then they pour a bunch of mixed up black and white marbles. And if the white marbles line up with your name, you're a juror for the day, and you listen to the trials and vote on whether people are guilty or innocent. Tomorrow, all new jury, they select it again, right? So what's the benefit of that?
No bias.
No what?
There's no bias.
Maybe no bias, but also no fraud, no bribery, right? You can't bribe the jury if you don't know who the jury's going to be, right? And so people go in, they get chosen, and then boom, they're on the jury, and they're deciding cases immediately. So there's no way to bribe them. I don't know if she mentions it, but also eventually the juries become quite big. So sometimes there's a jury of 500 people. So again, how are you going to bribe a jury of 500 people? Nobody has enough money, right? There's just no way to influence a trial when there's that many jurors and they're all chosen at random every day, right? It's impossible to corrupt the legal system that way. So they use those little things. Those are clariterions, by the way, the thing on the wall. So they use these ballot boxes. They use clariterions to choose juries. Yeah, and I think we've already answered that one. The idea that if you were going to become a member of the Council of 500 or a magistrate, some sort of a government official or a juror, it's all random selection, right? Anyone could fill any post if they were pulled, if their name was pulled, right? So it was a very democratic democracy, right? Everybody gets to vote as long as you're a property owning male Athenian citizen. So everyone should probably be in quotes, but everyone gets to vote and everyone can hold office. And indeed, if you were around long enough, you probably would, right? Your name would be pulled and you would be a juror or a magistrate, right? Or a member of the Council of 500, probably a bunch of times, right? So everyone kind of got a chance to participate, right? Everyone got a chance to be involved, for better or for worse. Yeah. And women have, we're almost out of time, so we want a lot of time to talk about this, but it's an interesting relationship that people in the ancient world have with women, right? Because they are revered as goddesses, sometimes for their wisdom or their strength or their ability to bear children or all of these things, but simultaneously they are, they have relatively tight controls in society and, do not have political or economic or social power. And yet they are worshipped as goddesses. And many of the major gods that we talked about already, I'd say almost a good half of them are women, right? Hera and Demeter and Aphrodite and Artemis and Athena, right? Those are the big main gods, and almost half of them are women. And so it's a very kind of interesting, maybe double standard's not the word, but it's almost like an oxymoron kind of thing, right? You have these women goddesses being worshipped while the mortal ones are, don't have societal power, can't vote. It's an interesting case of a culture that, and all cultures are like this, but cultures that can sort of somehow accommodate contradictory ideas at the same time, right? And all cultures are like this to some degree. They have some things that there seems to be a double standard about things, and the Greeks are no exception here. Okay, we've got more questions, but we've got no time. So come back tomorrow and we'll finish this. I posted about the quiz that we'll have on Friday. I posted in Microsoft Teams, so you can look at that. But until then, I will see you tomorrow. I'll see you tomorrow, and we'll...
all the India and China.
Yeah. Is that okay? It's too much? Think of the big ideas, right? Like the big important things that we talked about with those cultures. Not every detail is important, right? But I want to see the bigger ideas we talked about. Thank you. I'll see you tomorrow. All right. Bye, guys.